Silent Screams presents a bone-chilling tale of real-life horror that inspired one of the most infamous movies in the genre. Tonight, we journey into the heart of Amityville, where a beautiful suburban home became the stage for a terrifying nightmare. This story is a retelling from the perspective of George Lutz, the man who claimed to witness things that blurred the line between reality and madness. The first night in the house on 112 Ocean Avenue was quiet. The air was heavy with the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings. George Lutz ran his hands over the polished banister of the staircase as his wife, Kathy, unpacked in the living room. The kids' laughter echoed from the upstairs hallway, blending with the creaking floorboards, a sound that would soon haunt him. By midnight, the house had settled into a restless silence. George lay in bed, eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling, listening to Kathy's soft breathing beside him. Just as sleep began to claim him, a low noise stirred in the distance, a faint tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate. He sat up, muscles tensed, ears straining. The sound stopped. He shook his head, chuckling to himself. It was an old house. Old houses made noise. But when the tapping resumed, louder and insistent, the air shifted. It carried a chill that snaked across his skin, leaving goosebumps in its wake. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Kathy, and followed the sound down the stairs. The hallway was dark, lit only by the sliver of moonlight streaming through the window. Each step felt heavier than the last as he approached the source of the noise, the living room. The tapping grew louder, almost deafening. He reached out, hand trembling, and flipped the light switch. Nothing happened. The room remained shrouded in darkness. A sudden movement by the window made him freeze. George squinted, his breath catching in his throat. The faint outline of a figure stood outside, pressed against the glass. It was a man, or what looked like one head cocked at an unnatural angle, eyes wide and unblinking. But it wasn't the eyes that terrified George. It was the mouth, stretched into an impossibly wide grin. The lips were cracked, and the teeth, rows of jagged, broken shards, gleamed in the moonlight. George's knees buckled, and he staggered back, heart hammering against his ribcage. The figure's hand pressed against the window, leaving a smudge of something dark and wet. Before George could react, the apparition vanished, melting into the shadows of the yard. "George!" Kathy's voice, soft and uncertain, drifted from the top of the stairs. He swallowed hard, turning to see her silhouette framed by the hallway light. "Just checking something," he managed, his voice a rasp. She lingered a moment longer before disappearing back into the bedroom. George stood rooted to the spot, eyes darting from the window to the darkness outside. The night was silent again, but the memory of that twisted face etched itself deep into his mind. The following days were tense, filled with fleeting shadows and whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The children began to wake up crying in the middle of the night, claiming to see red eyes watching them from the hallway. Kathy dismissed it as nightmares, but George knew better. He felt it, an oppressive presence that seemed to follow him from room to room. One evening, as he worked in his small office, he felt a sudden, suffocating cold. It slithered down his neck, coiling around his spine. The desk lamp flickered, and the papers on his desk rustled without any draft. George looked up, meeting the eyes of his reflection in the dark window. But it wasn't alone. Behind him, a figure stood, its gaunt face half hidden in shadow, eyes burning red like embers. It leaned forward, its mouth moving as if whispering a secret, but George couldn't hear the words, only the roar of blood in his ears. He spun around, but the room was empty. The lamp steadied, casting a warm glow over the papers as if nothing had happened. George's hand shook as he wiped cold sweat from his brow. Days blurred into nights, each one more harrowing than the last. Kathy began to notice his pallor, the dark circles under his eyes. "Are you all right?" she would ask, her voice tinged with concern. But George couldn't tell her. How could he explain that he felt like the house was watching him, feeding off his fear? One night, the quiet was shattered by a scream. It was the youngest, Missy. George bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time. He burst into her room, breathless, to find her sitting upright in bed, eyes wide with terror. She pointed a tiny, trembling finger at the rocking chair in the corner. "It's Jody," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "She said she wants to be my friend." The chair creaked forward, and George's eyes snapped to it. The moonlight illuminated the chair, and for a heartbeat, he saw it. A pig-like creature with red, glowing eyes staring back at him, its snout curling up in a grotesque smile. He rushed to turn on the light, but by the time the room brightened, the chair was empty. George's breaths came in ragged gasps, and Kathy appeared at the door, eyes wide with confusion. "What happened?" "Nothing," he said, his voice thin and hollow. But Missy knew. She'd buried her face in her mother's arms, sobbing. In the kitchen that night, George sat alone, the silence pressing in on him like a suffocating blanket. The walls creaked as if shifting, the old pipes groaning deep within the house. The digital clock on the stove blinked, switching from 3:14 to 3:15. He closed his eyes, willing the room to stop spinning. When he opened them, the kitchen had changed. The room seemed darker, the air colder. The shadows seemed to writhe on their own, creeping toward him like living things. And then the tapping started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. It was coming from the basement.